We're now going to move to a special presentation and conversation on climate change. This is a critical topic we could not avoid as part of this conference. The next discussion will provide an opportunity to highlight the contributions of people on the forefront, leading the charge against climate change. Moderating this conversation is James Gordon, partner at Deloitte, focusing on supporting governments and public sector agencies to deliver outcomes to citizens. Over to you, James.
Great, thank you for that. And that's a tough act to follow for sure. But it's great to see so much BC representation so far, so thanks for that. As you said, this is a really important discussion that we're going to be talking about how governments can become more resilient in the face of significant climate events. I'm joined by Ian and Jane. Ian Meyer is the Executive Director of the BC Wildfire Service. He started on the front line, fighting fires way back when, and then he moved into the industry and then rejoined the fire service in 2000. Over the last 2 decades, he's played an important role in shaping that organization. In 2018, he was asked to lead the organization as the executive director and has taken the helm in the most challenging forest fire seasons that the province has experienced. So, Ian, great to have you with us. Jane Fraser-Jones is a partner and board member in Deloitte's New Zealand firm and is joining us from Wellington. So welcome. She leads our firm's crisis management and resilience business and has a focus on the agricultural sector. She has worked across many public sector organizations and levels of governments and with Indigenous organizations as well. Prior to joining Deloitte, she was a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, Right Honourable John Key. Again, pleasure to have you, Jane, with us. So this is a timely and important conversation that we're having. It comes off the back of BC having a devastating year in terms of climate events. They started with a heat dome that caused the death of 600 people and created the conditions for one of our worst forest fire seasons on record. It was then followed by a number of atmospheric river events, which created extensive flooding and mudslides, paralyzing communities, displacing thousands of people and killing livestock. It also severed many of our transportation arteries across the province and with the rest of Canada. The price tag is still being added up on those events, but it will well exceed multiple billions of dollars. As we work for long-term solutions like energy transition, building the circular economy, and implementing zero waste initiatives, there's important work that government must do across all levels of government in building more resilience in our infrastructure, communities, and economies. But these are going to take bold steps from strong leaders to make it happen at the pace that it needs to happen. How we fund these activities, what kind of governance structures do we need to have in place that will cut across jurisdictional lines and make sure that the resources are in place to prevent and become more resilient. And there's going to be difficult decisions to be made within communities that are in high-risk zones going forward. These will challenge our resolve and in terms of making it happen. But I am encouraged in terms of what I'm seeing in terms of progress. The BC government, BC provincial government tabled its budget on Tuesday, and in there it contained $2 billion in climate resilience funding for this fiscal year. It's calling for the establishment of an ESG Center of Excellence for government, industry, and communities that will shape the initiatives going forward in terms of how they deal with these kinds of situations. And it also provides some exciting changes in terms of how we approach forest firefighting, which I'm sure Ian, you'll touch on as we go through. If there were still questions around the need for such measures, it was interesting yesterday, the UN Environment Program released a report saying that we are in a global wildfire crisis and that we have a heightened elevated risk across all regions, including the Arctic. Research indicates that extreme fire events will increase by 14% in 2030, 30% in 2050, and 50% by the turn of the century. It's calling for shifts in funding allocations away from more of a reaction and response method to more proactive and prevention. It also highlights the importance of incorporating Indigenous knowledge and stronger regional international cooperation. Against that backdrop, we'd like to share a video that puts us in high resolution that's provided by the BC Wildfire Service. We will have lots of opportunity for folks to have questions, so do please put them in the Q&A section. And with that, let's cue the video.
In 2021, British Columbia faced one of its most challenging fire seasons on record. Temperatures climbed throughout June, culminating in a historic heat dome that broke records and affected the entire province. The dryness and extreme heat raised fire danger to extreme levels. These conditions persisted throughout the province and lasted into August in some regions, making fuels extremely dry and susceptible to ignition. This, combined with repeated severe lightning events, which resulted in more than 200,000 lightning strikes, contributed to an average of 40 new fire starts a day, challenging fire behavior, rapid fire growth, and increased growth on existing wildfires. Overall, resulting in 1,610 wildfires that burned 868,203 hectares across BC from April 1st to September 30th. Over 60% of those fires were naturally caused. At the peak of the 2021 season, nearly 4,000 personnel were involved in response efforts. The majority of all wildfires in British Columbia are quickly contained and extinguished by personnel on the ground. Our highly trained crews are successful in containing over 90% of all wildfires in BC by 10 a.m. the day after they are initially discovered. Aviation resources, including rotary and fixed-wing aircraft, also assist ground crews as needed. In 2021, 9 air tanker groups were strategically stationed throughout the province, including one group from Alberta. Air tankers completed about 700 missions during the fire season, supporting our crews on the ground. Our workforce is adaptable, inclusive, and united. We approach our work with an open, innovative mindset, and we know that we can't do it alone, which is why we value our partnerships. Our organization relies heavily on the support and cooperation from our partners, including Indigenous nations, local governments and communities, provincial agencies, academic institutions, and national and international emergency management and wildfire organizations, as we work collectively to contribute to a more resilient British Columbia. At the peak of the 2021 wildfire season, over 1,400 contracted personnel were also involved in response efforts. The forest industry redirected significant resources to help with firefighting efforts. Industry equipment was strategically placed throughout the province, allowing for faster response to new incidents and access to important pieces of heavy equipment. Forest industry personnel provided crucial support on many large wildfires, and they responded directly to a number of wildfires with minimal assistance from BC Wildfire Service. In 2021, we worked closely with First Nations to improve coordination, help our team gain heightened cultural awareness and understanding, and harness local traditional information on many wildfires. For more than a century, the BC Wildfire Service has enhanced our expertise and built a record of achievement as a professional wildfire fighting organization. We know that we cannot assume that the way we have always done things will continue to work. We are committed to learning, and as climate change, extreme weather, and shifting forest conditions impact our province, we will shift and advance our tactics and response in order to protect and promote what makes BC special. In order to protect the landscape, we must understand it, and we are committed to implementing an approach based on science and experience to execute strategies that work. This allows us to be better informed, safer, and more efficient in all areas of our business. Throughout recent years, the BC Wildfire Service has increasingly taken on responsibilities associated with preparing for and responding to natural hazards such as floods and landslides, as well as other emergencies. As the province of British Columbia joins governments around the world in a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach to emergency management, the BC Wildfire Service will continue to provide world-renowned firefighting expertise and will evolve into a natural hazards response organization. Over the next 5 years, we are shifting from a largely seasonal workforce to a year-round organization that can continue to be relied upon and trusted by British Columbians to deliver wildfire management, natural hazard preparedness, and response services. Throughout our 110-year history, we have adapted and expanded to meet the changing needs of the day. The BC Wildfire Service is more than just a branch of government. We are a collection of people, programs, and resources dedicated to supporting and protecting our province and the people of British Columbia.
Wow, that is a very impressive video, and just really demonstrates the breadth of service that you folks provide and the important role that it is. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your organization, Ian?
Yeah, thanks, James. As you said in the beginning, I've been able to be in this organization for many years. I was able to start on a crew and work my way through it. So I've been able to see a lot of the evolution. We have not stood still from the time I started till now, and a lot of it has been a nice slow progression. We, back not that long ago, we were a predominantly seasonal organization, really focused on the backcountry, and now, as our seasons started to extend, we started to adjust and extend our crew, our whole organization across an extended season. And now we're not only in the backcountry, we're in the forecountry. We're working in and around communities, and really beyond the wildfire hazard. We're, like the video said, we're working in floods, landslides. The Atmospheric River saw us step into a role that we've never done before in supporting communities. So we've, at full capacity, we're during the summer months, we have almost 1,800 staff, and then as we start to ramp up during the season, we have a great network throughout the government and mostly our ministry in bringing on temporary assistance through our Teams program, and it really brings together a big, strong team. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. And certainly there was some exciting news in the budget and that was mentioned in the video. Do you want to tell us a little bit more around how the organization now is shifting to a more broader mandate?
Yeah, we have been in responding to the beyond wildfires, and I think our government has provided a significant investment into our organization now to broaden out that capacity. And the capacity really is to better able to connect with our communities, our partners, better able to cross-train and really build strong relationships. So when we hit these crisis events, we're ready. We have strong relationships. We're not getting to know each other in the crisis. So, and the focus, and we heard it in your opening, where there's a focus on response. And that was our organization not that long ago. We really focused on the response, the reactive side of things. We're a 4-pillar of emergency management organization, and now we're getting the investment to be able to add capacity to build out those other areas, as well as augment our response capacity as well.
That's fantastic. And I know there's also, it's a bit of an international community as well, in terms of when these significant events happen, you draw on, all kinds of different resources from globally. I remember there were, I think, Mexican forest fires up here, forest fighters up here in the summer, et cetera. How does that sort of whole mechanism work? And do you see that as an important continuation of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, our partnerships around the world are really important. We're all in it together. Australia is going through similar challenges. New Zealand, we have good partnership there. We had New Zealand resources come to BC in 2018. And we're now at a place where across the globe, it's open book. We're sharing our experiences going through the pandemic. We were having calls with Australia once a week, so we can share how we're approaching COVID protocols, and we're sharing. Established a great relationship now with California, Oregon, and Washington. So we have resources across Canada. Are the main body there. The Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center is the hub for us and helps navigate our relationships. But really, it's a global issue, and we're working really well together to share our best practices and our experiences.
No, that's great. I remember many years ago, I actually did a piece of work for the Wildfire Service, which was looking to support a Treasury Board submission around the business case in terms of the funding model that was in play then. And I remember one thing that has always struck me was one of the challenges, structural challenges on the funding side, was that because the monies weren't committed, it was a year-on-year type budgeting process. The Forest Service, the Wildfire Service was not able to commit to longer-term contracts, as an example, around helicopter support or what have you. And to me, that was just a structural issue that sort of got in the way of probably making some good decisions. And is it through these have those kinds of things been rectified over the years? And do you feel like some of those structural barriers are coming down to allow for more proactive, more resilient type activities?
Yes, I don't feel we have those same barriers in place. We've been getting great support from government in reducing barriers, investing in the organization, and investing in all pillars of emergency management, so we can work with our communities to add capacity that's homegrown, so we can really tap into that local knowledge and traditional knowledge. So I see, sometimes the only barriers are ourselves and how much we can really get done. So no, we have great support.
That's great. One thing I do remember, growing up in this province as a kid, that, as you said, the forest fires tended to be in the backcountry, sort of far away from sort of urban areas or rural areas. And now it's not uncommon to be driving down a highway and seeing a bushfire, just outside of, the Vancouver proper area. How has this changed, and what is driving that, and how does the organization respond to those kinds of new realities around how these forest fires and fires, landscape fires are coming up?
Yeah, we are seeing a push out of the urban centers into rural BC. Some of our, like Vancouver, is very unaffordable to live, and so we're seeing that sprawl. So that increases our urban interface, and as we see like this year with the heat dome and then the dry lightning events, it's inevitable that those fires are going to intersect with the communities. And so we no longer can just say we're a backcountry organization. We're adjusting our training. We're going to adjust how we work together with the communities. And so we can integrate and our systems and work together closer. And that's what some of this investment is going to allow us to do that work in the off season, and do that cross training. So when we get into the season, we're ready to go.
Got it. We do have a question from the audience, so thank you, Margie. And this is really around looking at the tension between investments being made to combat climate change, and then some of the economic practices around resource extraction, et cetera. And just wondering how does that conversation happen, and how do you sort of plan for that, recognizing there is going to be that extractive activity on the land base that will impact or could impact the nature of the types of responses that you're going to be asked to respond to?
Yeah, we need to factor in fire into our planning on the front end. I think in the past we didn't really factor it in to the degree that we need to. We're seeing a real shift in the desire to do land use planning and making sure climate change is factored into that. We do need to sustain our economy, and there is a way to do it that we can do it together and make sure that we're not adding more risk to the land base than we already have. So it's all in that land use planning, and we're at the table now, and that's very exciting for us.
That's great. Jane, you've been patiently sitting there listening to all of this. Let's turn to you for a bit. You want to give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, sure, I will, James, thank you. And Ian, that was such a fascinating video and talk, and it was really great to hear that Kiwi firefighters were working with you and your team in 2018. I know that the scale of bushfires and forest fires that we have here are certainly not on the same scale as Canada and Australia experience, but I suppose the camaraderie and ability to share information, resources, and people is huge amount of bravery, and it's awesome to hear about those stories. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. James had asked me to talk a little bit about aspects of crisis and resilience, along with thoughts around climate and a perspective on from New Zealand on dealing with that. I was a little bit hesitant because I was unsure if some of the issues that we experience in New Zealand would be of relevance or interest in Canada. But to be honest, just from talking to James and also hearing what Ian's talked about, we really are grappling with some of the similar issues and looking at probably similar solutions as well, which I'll sort of touch on a little bit later on. I sort of wanted to talk a bit about crisis and resilience first, sort of less about climate, because they do sort of fit together, at least from my experiences anyway. And in my old job, working for the Prime Minister, you become very adaptive and agile in terms of coping with crises of different magnitudes. The first crisis I probably really dealt with was in 2010. We were in Port Vila, Vanuatu for the Pacific Islands Forum. And on our first night in the hotel, I was woken up in the middle of the night by our Foreign Office staff member. New Zealand had suffered its first casualty in Afghanistan, and the night was spent working with our office back in Wellington, arranging interviews with media back home and with the travelling press corps. It was hugely devastating for our Defence Force people who we were travelling with. Hugely devastating for the family, and it was a real sort of raw and close sorrow, particularly for such a small country as New Zealand. So that was sort of the first experience I really had of I suppose, dealing with an issue which might seem smallish on a global scale, but was hugely impactful for a range of people and at a national level as well. The Christchurch earthquakes were at a completely different scale. And the first one was in September of 2010, and it was actually of a greater magnitude than the February 2011 earthquake, which was fatal. And, it was really sobering seeing that city just flattened, really. I'd flown down with the Prime Minister the day after the earthquake met a huge range of people, from emergency services workers, local council people, tourists who had left their hotel with nothing but their dressing gown. It was just, it was really is amazing to see the devastation that a natural disaster can cause. And probably going to Ian's point around, the sort of international camaraderie, within probably hours, if not days, we had specialist emergency services workers, search and rescue people, urban search and rescue people coming in from various countries to assist and really bolster the New Zealand effort. So it is amazing to see how countries and people can pull together in those times of crisis.
When you think of the types of experiences that you've had, in the face of a crisis, what lessons do you draw from that in terms of the important things that you got to get right to get the action going?
I think the main thing, I reckon, James, would be communication. And it's something everyone says, good communication, lots of communication, but it is so easy for people to lose their head and for communication to kind of go out the window because you're dealing with the issue right in front of you. And I really did learn a lot about staying on track in terms of ensuring that there is very crystal clear and unambiguous communication, which is quite difficult to do when you're moving in a very fluid situation as well, and the situation is changing minute by minute, if not hour by hour. It's a real skill to learn. The other thing I would say is that, I was probably really not taken aback, but there is huge amount of power to be had and to be said of relationships between world leaders. We were incredibly lucky in New Zealand at the time. Prime Minister Key had an amazing relationship with Prime Minister Gillard in Australia. And, they are prime ministers of different parties from different sides of the aisle, but they could find huge common ground. And, the efforts the Australian government gave to us was amazing. And a lot of that was actually driven right from the top. So, political leaders have got great power to help with that. The other thing I reckon is we take it for granted in countries like New Zealand and Canada, really well-functioning democracies. We have a public service in our countries that work. They get the jobs done. They're well organised. They're resourced up. I think we take it for granted just how smoothly our public services can swing into action, really, and mobilise in the face of crises. And you really, have to take your hats off to everyone, from people who might be working in a tax department through to frontline workers in the defence, police force and emergency services, teachers. All of those public servants need to respond in different ways, and they really do, I think, have great agility. And I think that's that's a really key point, and probably something where I think the public sector sort of can stand up and a light has really shone upon them in times of crisis.
And we've certainly seen that in COVID, even before, certainly what we've experienced in BC. I know you spend a lot of time in the agribusiness and it's also seen as a high, impact area or industry on climate change. I'm curious, what's happening in New Zealand? Because I know they're leading the way in some cases, and I'm sure it'd be interesting to hear a bit about what's happening there.
Yeah, sure. So, agribusiness is a real passion of mine. I grew up on a farm, or my family are farmers. There's a particular part of the Waikato, which is the province I'm from, where there are lots of Fraser Jones farmers. I grew up on a farm about 30 minutes away from Hobbiton, for those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans. And agriculture is a massive it's a massive export earner for New Zealand. It's a huge part of our economy, but it's also one of our largest emitting sectors. So New Zealand is a real outlier compared to other developed nations in terms of our emissions profile. Transport and agriculture comprise the bulk of our emissions. We don't have nuclear power. In fact, the vast bulk of our electricity is from renewables, over 90%, and we don't really have a mining or extractive sector to speak of either. And several years ago, the government here banned new exploration permits. So it's a very, very small sector. We're a very efficient agricultural producer as well, and I'm biased, I'm a cheerleader for New Zealand agriculture, so I'll just paint a bit of context in that respect. But you know, our emissions per kilo of meat and milk have declined by about 1% year on year since 1990, and that's really down to a combination of things like better animal genetics, better feed, that kind of stuff. We also have got a very different farming system to what you'd probably see in North America. So we have a pastoral based farming system, which is different to the confinement system you might normally see in places in parts of Canada and in the Midwest. I was talking a couple of years ago to a agribusiness owner in Brussels, Ontario, for a piece of work I was doing around agri-tech. And he was saying to me that the New Zealand story of seeing animals in paddocks and pasture roaming free was a very compelling story, you know, from a Canadian standpoint. And that's something that in New Zealand we're really proud of. It's an efficient system. But the reality is, as agriculture is such a big part of our emissions profile, the government has mandated that agricultural emissions will need to be priced, which I think New Zealand would be the first country to do so. At this point in time, agriculture would have to enter our national emissions trading scheme by the 1st of January 2025, unless an alternative pricing scheme for agriculture can be developed and agreed upon and mandated by Cabinet. So that's really, you know, a huge part of the work that's going on here. And there are a lot of reasons for it. You know, we're a small trade exposed nation. We rely on international trade, and some of the hallmarks of our agricultural exports, which have given us market success, may soon become aspects we have to satisfy in order to have market access. So, you know, being able to track emissions and things like that, ethical produce, they're all going to be more and more important as time goes on, and will give our farmers the social license to keep operating as well.
Absolutely. The Indigenous, the importance of Indigenous and the impact that Indigenous communities have had across our country in terms of climate events has been significant. And I'm interested to hear what has that been like, and what has the experience been in New Zealand, and what is the government doing to better equip, better enable, better include Indigenous nations in the policy frameworks and the actions that are being taken?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have to say, again, another parallel with what Ian was saying in terms of your bushfires and taking on board local and Indigenous knowledge in the management of those. That's a very similar step which is being embedded in things like biosecurity issues and endemic pests and climate change here in New Zealand. So we have a concept called Mataranga Māori, which is Indigenous knowledge, and that's really treated on a similar level to traditional Western science as well when it comes to tackling some big environmental issues. And I just wanted to say as well that from what I'm certainly no law expert, and certainly not an expert in constitutional law, but I do know from talking to friends who work in that space. One of my friends is a Pro-Vice Chancellor at the university here in Wellington and specialises in New Zealand constitutional law. He often points to examples of what's happening in Canadian law regarding how your provincial and federal governments work with First Nations. So I thought that was quite interesting. With regards to agricultural emissions, Māori landowners are a huge part of our agricultural or primary sector economy. They, big forestry owners, farmers of sheep, beef, dairy, and increasingly really big horticultural export crops like avocado and kiwi fruit. There is a pan-industry group in New Zealand called He Waka Eke Noa, which comprises Māori farmers and Māori landowners, along with representatives from industry peak bodies, from sheep, beef, dairy, and fruit and vegetable growing, to work on agricultural pricing, agricultural emissions pricing scheme. And this is really important because there are issues particular to Māori land ownership that is not prevalent in other forms of land ownership. Often, an iwi or tribe will have a large land holding which will have a multiplicity of owners over several generations. And the more and more people with an interest in a particular parcel of land, the more difficult it can be to make decisions around, land diversification, things like that. So there really are particular considerations the government will need to take into account when ensuring that any pricing of agricultural emissions does not impact unduly, unfairly upon Māori landowners, because that may be seen as a breach of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the founding document of New Zealand, signed by the Crown and a number of iwi in 1840. So yeah, it's certainly a huge, it's a really, really huge part of how the climate problem is being approached here.
Interesting. There's probably a lot of parallels between our two countries in terms of what that looks like. Ian, I'm curious from your perspective as you look out and I guess maybe look back a bit and then look forward in terms of how have you seen resiliency being talked about, in government circles and specifically in the area that you're focused in, and how do you see that has shifted, and maybe what are some of the drivers that are shifting that conversation?
The big first step is we're talking about it.
Yeah.
And the desire to understand and get to a common understanding of what we're talking about. And there's resiliency. Sometimes I fear we use it too much and it becomes an overused term. But there's the resiliency of the land, but there's also resiliency of the people. And our organization, we're proud on the fact that we are resilient, but what we're seeing is the successive seasons and events that are hitting, and that cumulative effect on our people is impacting our ability to bounce back and be more resilient. In order for us to be effective leaders, I think we need to be able to be resilient ourselves and take care of ourselves. A previous speaker I managed to catch, take care of yourself first, and so you can take care of others. Mm-hmm. And so we're really, as an organization, focusing on our people and how that total well-being, and how, especially on the mental health side of things, that way when we work with our communities and our partners, we can empathize with some of what they're going through and really deepen the relationships. It also allows us, when you deepen that relationship, is to understand that local knowledge and the local landscape and the land base, and have a better, stronger understanding of what we need to do and adjust the way we do business as needed. So, yeah.
I think that's hit a couple of high notes on Kaylee's question, and I'm just curious: are there different leadership attributes that you think today and tomorrow's leader is going to need to have to be successful in leading organizations that are focused on resiliency?
Yeah, for me, the ability to listen and truly listen. And as a leader, say when you don't know, be vulnerable. It's easy to say to be vulnerable until you're challenged with it. And sometimes I think the leaders feel they have to be strong and not show vulnerability. I think that's a mistake. I think that's a true sign that we're in it together, is when we truly understand where each of us are coming from and have the ability to say, I don't know, or I made a mistake, or whatever it may be, that vulnerability.
Jane, are you same question to you? Are you seeing a shift in leadership style, a shift in or leadership need rather, in terms of what will work to help lead our organizations in this new era?
I think we're probably seeing the same things here as Ian described as well. There was a concept I've been discussing with one of my colleagues, actually, sort of moving resilience on to something called anti-fragility. So I suppose experiencing a crisis or a shock, but then adapting and being the better for it. And I think that was a really interesting concept, because I think, particularly over the past few years, with the pandemic and other various things people have had to deal with, it has changed leadership styles, the need to be adaptive, the need to try new things. And I think that as Ian said, being able to listen, but also being open to change and potentially trying to use a shock to change things for the better, not going back to how it was in 2019, for example, because that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And when I think of what's going to be required of our next leaders, I think those are absolute traits and characteristics of them. I also think there's some technical aspects of the job. And it was interesting in the UN report that was released yesterday. They commented on the need to have more data-driven approaches, policies, decision-making with the new technologies that are coming available, AI, et cetera. They're really giving us, I think, a different perspective or different lens into, and possibly an earlier lens into, some of the things that we might be faced with in the future. And we saw in the budget from BC yesterday on Tuesday that the River Forecasting Center was going to be getting more funding to look at the data side. And I'm curious, Ian, are you seeing sort of the data science piece becoming more important as we think about how we become more resilient as organizations, as society going forward?
It's huge. We've stood up a predictive services unit within BC Wildfire Service, where our forecasters and we're sharing data across with the River Forecast Center, because again, in an all hazard capacity, what they're telling us, we need to adjust our organization to be able to support the communities and be able to respond for flooding, for example. So that sophistication and the data that we get has to be good. If we're going to make good decisions around the safety of British Columbians, you need good, solid data and be able to make decisions on it. Not rely on it blindly. You do need that experience, and you do need to make a decision. and be able to navigate the chaos, but it has to be on good data. And so we're definitely putting a lot of investment into that side of our business and trying to get the best available for our decision makers.
Jane, what about you? Are you seeing it, maybe more in the agri-food business and how they're using it? It was interesting. I was talking to somebody about food security today, and they mentioned the ability to actually, much like we have, or we will be coming to other parts of Canada. I know it's already there, where you actually have, for example, calorie counts on menus to see, how much is that hamburger in terms of calories that you're going to eat. We're probably not that far off to say, if you choose a latte with oat milk versus a latte with regular dairy milk, what kind of carbon footprint are you creating or not? Do you see that kind of conversation to help shift consumers' minds in terms of becoming more aware of the decisions they're making and the impact that those decisions could have on the environment?
Yes, absolutely. One of the key aspects of pricing agricultural emissions here will actually be getting the right tool and emissions calculation, and the ability to do that ideally at a farm level rather than at a processor level. At the moment, farmers are dealing with a multiplicity of data sets that measure different things, from their animal tracing to the nutrients that they use on their land. And there certainly is a need to be able to create some, not only something new to measure emissions, but also, the ability for interoperability and integration as well. Certainly, another large part of that for our exporters is around digital identity. So being able to track and trace products easily from farm right through to export markets, but also with digital identity to make compliance for farmers seamless and hassle-free, particularly when it comes to verifying export permits and things like that. So that's a really key part of things here as well.
That's great. If we sort of step back a bit out of your specific areas, what are you seeing across government, whether it's provincial, state, local, what have you, where you're seeing organizations really take a step forward in thinking about how we're going to fortify and make more resilient our infrastructure, our economies, et cetera? Is there anything that sort of is you're looking out and seeing sort of real progress and hope? Maybe Ian, can we start with you?
Yeah, last week I was able to take part in some of the Pan-Canadian roundtables, and to do with wildfire and the diversity, the cross-section of people that came, the alignment, and the problem is real. We gotta move. No more talk about it. We gotta do something. That was from highest levels of federal and provincial governments to local governments and stakeholders and academics. And so that, to see people like that across Canada come together at these tables and be willing to share, willing to step forward and talk about it, and all be aligned and say, you know what, we have to do something now. That was, to me, was the aha moment that we're moving in the right direction. We're getting the right support. Now this is our window of opportunity. Let's take advantage of it.
Well, that's great to hear and very encouraging. Jane, what about down in New Zealand or in the Pacific region? What are you seeing down there that is giving you hope in terms of that we're getting collectively aligned and moving forward?
I think, James, I think there is increasingly more attention being paid to the wider Pacific region from a range of countries, particularly those of us like Canada and New Zealand who sit on the Pacific Rim, there's a range of issues to deal with in terms of ensuring that people in the Pacific Islands are able to transition from fossil fuel to more efficient forms of energy. We also have to think about the possibility of climate refugees. I know that, for example, in Fiji, certain parts of the country and parts of certain islands are being designated as zones that will soon flood. And I think we are seeing a lot more international collaboration and cooperation in the Pacific. The other area I just wanted to touch on was Antarctica. You mentioned the Arctic, which is on your doorstep, really, James. Antarctica's on ours. Christchurch is the last stop before you get to Antarctica. So all the researchers from Canada, America, Latin America come through New Zealand in order to go to Antarctica. It's, you know, a living museum really of Earth's sort of past life and environmental cycles. And I think we're also seeing a lot of collaboration there from the international scientific community around protecting and preserving Antarctica, but also using the research there to advance the causes of humanity generally. So I think that gives me a lot of hope as well.
Well, that's very encouraging. I'm curious, in terms of you both have talked to some good momentum and sort of, I guess, widespread awareness that things have changed and we need to move forward. I'm curious, how much has the pandemic or the reality that this has sort of been against the pandemic or a backdrop of a pandemic, how has that brought people more together and more aligned in terms of things that we need to do from a public policy perspective, et cetera? Ian, do you have you seen anything? Do you see any of that happening where you're seeing more collaboration, more intent around aligning policies, et cetera, to recognizing that there's some interdependencies that we need to streamline and get right?
I wouldn't put it all on the pandemic. I would say a heat dome, a bad fire season, an atmospheric river, all while dealing with a pandemic. It has shown some significant vulnerabilities in all the systems, and highlighted some gaps. And so I know when the pandemic first hit, we had to quickly stop and we had to re-examine our whole organization with that lens. And I would say all of society had to take a pause and reevaluate and adjust. So it's really forced us to take a step back and take a look at how everything fits together. Then you fit in all of the other hazards that have hit us in the last 12 months. You know, the heat dome was a 1 in 1,000-year event. The atmospheric river was a 1 in 1,000-year event. It was almost the year of the 1 in 1,000 event.
Yeah.
So it's really, now we are having to really look at the whole system and the vulnerabilities that are within the system for the next time, and how to build in some redundancies and build the supply chain stronger, et cetera, et cetera. So I look at the pandemic was a major disruptor, and then you throw in these other incidents on top, and it has really made us take a step back. And I think it's brought us together because we're now, I know for sure within our government and within my peers, asking more questions about, okay, so how does what we're dealing with impact you? And if we're going through a fire season, how do we work together? Because there's a realization now that it's not just a BC Wildfire Service problem. It is across British Columbia, across the sector's problem, and we need to figure out ways to do it together.
I think that's very right, and I've had the opportunity to work within the DIRT ministries for a long time, and it's interesting, and a perspective is that land use planning has sort of come in and out of vogue, over the years, and I really feel like now it's at the forefront of policy and decision making, and I wonder, Jane, are you seeing sort of this notion of land use planning being a critical instrument in driving, a resiliency agenda going forward in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a really big issue here, from a range of reasons. Probably might be similar reasons in Canada too. We've got areas on the outskirts of large cities, which is highly productive farmland, which is being broken up into lifestyle blocks or being built up into suburbs. Which, one hand, there's a housing crisis in New Zealand. We need more houses. On the other hand, we also need affordable food grown locally as well. I did some work a couple of years ago looking really at land use change in a particular area of the country and the effect that would have on the volume and value of fresh fruit and vegetables. And, that then has a whole range of consequences by putting fresh fruit and vegetables out of the reach of people who might have very limited food budgets. It also could, decrease export revenues, for example. That's another key issue. Another really big issue here in New Zealand from a climate perspective is around the use of plantation forestry as carbon sinks. So, we've often grown particularly pine forests in New Zealand, usually on low value land, which might be erosion prone, very steep gradient. You're not really going to graze any cattle or anything on that. It's not particularly productive. But now, just with the way the carbon market is, productive land is being bought and planted in pine forestry. On one hand, that could be great from a climate perspective. On the other hand, it has impacts upon rural communities because it's taking away jobs and it's also taking away food production. And in fact, the government recently, like this week, just passed legislation to make it more difficult for foreign ownership of plantation forestry in New Zealand, largely to sort of stem that impact around land conversion. But so certainly it is an issue here, and there are those trade-offs that need to be weighed up, really sort of across a range of contexts.
Mm. And we're getting close to wrapping up here. And Ian, I'm curious in terms of your view as you look forward, what do you think are going to be the challenges that government is going to need to get over to build that resilience at pace that it's, that I think many of us feel is going to be needing to be there? Is there a couple of things that sort of stick out for you that we got to get right?
I think first and foremost is the community involvement, and whether it's Indigenous or non, we need to get that right. And there is an ownership that the communities want, and so we need to understand how we're going to work together. The challenges we see are there's so many values on every square foot of British Columbia. And how do you balance those? And that's where getting back to that land use planning, it can't be done in silos. The plans need to talk and be able to connect together. Otherwise, one can have a positive impact for a certain area of society and a negative impact in the other if they're not connected. So they really do need to be de-siloed.
Yeah. Last word to you, Jane. Anything that you want to call out?
Oh, look, it's been a really great conversation, and I've learned a lot talking, hearing Ian speak, but also it sort of reinforced to me that there are some really broad, comparable parallels between what our two countries are dealing with and how we're approaching them as well. It's really fascinating. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to Jane, you and Ian for sharing your stories and perspectives. And it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you, James, Ian, and Jane for this engaging conversation sponsored by Deloitte. While this conference has been brought to you virtually, the IPAC Annual National Conference has long been a sought-after, in-person, federal, provincial, municipal gathering. The 75th anniversary for IPAC will be held in Toronto between September 7th and 9th, both in person and virtually. I would now like to introduce IPAC President Paul Laflèche, Deputy Minister, Departments of Seniors and Long-Term Care, and Municipal Affairs and Housing for the Government of Nova Scotia. He will let you know what you can expect from IPAC this year.
We'll all receive an email next week with access to a recording of the sessions. This means you can watch the ones you missed, or perhaps you want to go back and listen to some of the advice on leadership that Ambassador Ray shared with us, or the advice from the panel on women in leadership. There were so many great sessions, but two that really resonated with me were the future of work and the session on mindful leadership. We had representation from all across Canada, Australia, and even the Cayman Islands. With over 1,000 people registered, this was the largest event IPAC has put on, and we thank you for your support today. I hope to meet many of you in person at our annual conference in Toronto this September when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of IPAC. Thank you.
My apologies. So IPAC really looks forward to welcoming you in Toronto this September. While we have reached the end of our official program, we aren't quite done yet. We know that conference participants value networking with one another. I would echo also our IPAC President Paul Laflèche by reiterating that all our sessions have been recorded so that you can watch any session on demand through our YouTube channel. You will receive the viewing link at the same time as we will send you the e-survey from SurveyMonkey in the next few days. We really want to capture your ideas on how we can make our summits even better. Immediately following this, at 5 p.m. Eastern, we will close our summit festivities with Yaprak Baltichulu, 2021 Vanier Medal recipient. She is a fantastic home cook and has a huge following on Instagram at yapraks_kitchen. IPAC provided the ingredient list to the conference participant earlier this month, so hopefully you will be ready to cook along with Yaprak. But even if you haven't, you'll want to join for what will be both an educational and delicious time. You can access this session by clicking the Zoom link in the agenda tab on the left-hand side of the platform. There will also be breakout rooms for networking for those who want to catch up with fellow attendees. Thank you to all our partners who have made our time together possible. Deloitte, PwC Canada, MNP, Ted Rogers School of Management, Ryerson University, AMAPCO, University of Waterloo, CPA Canada, National Bank of Canada, and The Personal. On behalf of IPAC, I hope that you have enjoyed your time with us and that you have gained a new perspective on leadership now and in the post-pandemic recovery. IPAC is Canada's largest network for public servants and works tirelessly to promote public service excellence. Thank you for being part of that journey. If you are not already a member, we encourage you to join us. Please visit our website at ipac.ca to learn more about IPAC, join or renew your membership, and keep up to date on all of our great events, training, and opportunities. Merci beaucoup et au plaisir de vous revoir.